The proceeding will...
4, 3... Order. The committee is in session. We continue this morning our inquiry into the cyber resilience of the UK's critical national infrastructure. And to help us with that, I'm pleased to welcome our first pair of witnesses. And we have with us here today Professor John Goodacre, who is Professor of Computer Architecture at the University of Manchester and is also the Challenge Director of the Digital Security by Design programme at Innovate UK, the Government Innovation Agency. And joining him with us this morning is Mr. Richard Grisenthwaite, who is the Executive Vice President and Chief Architect at ARM. Thank you very much indeed, both of you, for joining us today. Perhaps I can start with Professor Goodacre. And could you just brief the committee, tell us what the key principles of secure by design and default are?
Yes, I can indeed. So what I might actually do is just expand that question just slightly to bring in the definition of cybersecurity in that context as well. So if we look at what cybersecurity today is, it's primarily the risk management, the response. How do you maintain your systems if you are attacked and when you are attacked? And that is done by the person that is responsible for that system. If we start looking at by default, that's where the responsibility is moving earlier in the supply chain of the people building the systems, where they are trying to reduce the likelihood of there being vulnerabilities which can be exploited. So obviously there are less manufacturers than there are users in that regard. So it is good to start pushing the responsibility for security down into the supply chain, and by default is making sure the product doesn't have as many likely vulnerabilities by default. Okay, so don't turn on features if the user isn't going to use them, because all that doing is going to make it more likely that there's something they don't know about which can be attacked. When we get to by design, this is where security is implemented within the design process of the products that those companies use or build. This is where they select components which are being architected or built in a way which can protect the user from the effects of vulnerabilities. So it's basically in the design process you are designing, by design, security principles into those products.
Thank you very much indeed. And Mr. Grisenthwaite, as someone that is the chief architect of ARM, therefore are involved in planning and designing new innovations, how prevalent is this in your thinking in the company?
Well, I mean, security is one of the fundamental principles that we have to obey, because the whole premise of computing, you have to be able to trust it. And the issue is not so much, do we care about security? Absolutely we care, and we've always put in lots of features that for very well-written software, or for well-written software, will inherently be secure. The challenge is that there are increasingly complex techniques that people use to find minor flaws in software and then exploit security. So the question then is, what do we do about that? How do we make it resilient against not just, how do we make it secure in the face of improperly designed software, the small amounts of error, because there are millions and millions of lines of code in software, and the idea that you could have perfect software is a fallacy. I mean, the reality is everybody makes mistakes, and those mistakes don't always get picked up. And so there will always be these security vulnerabilities. And so increasingly at ARM, for the last 20 years, we've been incrementally adding features to try and address security issues as they become aware of them. There's a particular class of problem that seems to be incredibly prevalent. It's called memory safety. I won't go into the details of exactly what that means, but some 70% of the reported vulnerabilities in software for many years, it's been almost a consistent run rate, find their root cause in memory safety. And we've been looking for years at ways that we can be enhancing the architecture to provide that resilience when there are these issues in software, that essentially means that if they either they can be found when you try running them, or in the event that somebody finds an exploit, you can limit the damage that can be caused as a result of that.
I see. Tell me, how within the company do you take steps to make sure that there aren't people who've, as it were, sort of smuggled themselves into the company that are embedding things that might be useful to outsiders later on?
I mean, it's a good question. We have a very strong culture of peer review of our hardware as we design it. And the way you design hardware is you write it in a what's called a hardware description language, an HDL, and that stuff is regularly reviewed by peers. And so it would need a sort of a collusion of multiple people for somebody able to smuggle something in like that.
Thank you. Let me turn to my colleagues for some more questions. Graham Stringer to start, and then Dawn Butler.
I think this question is to both of you, but can you tell us what the state of play is at the present time in using secure by design and default on the national infrastructure?
I'll start on that one. Thank you, Richard. So what I'll say is by design, by default are actually two fairly new terms. Okay, they are terms that have evolved in the last 5 years, and the definition I gave you is one that is evolving as the preferred definition, primarily through an agency called CISA in the US, and they are cementing those terminology. Therefore, in terms of those technologies specifically being deployed into C&I today, I don't believe they are going beyond the attack reduction aspect. So the by default is something that they can do today. So when you deploy a system, you consider the configuration of that system and minimize its attack. The challenge by design is that we've been looking at, or in the program at the time, the director for the Digital Security by Design program, we've been looking at a technology which Richard alluded to called Cherry, which say it protects against the exploitation of these memory safety issues. That today is not commercially available, so that clearly is not as part of the C&I deployment today. However, there are other by design approaches. For example, there's one called Root of Trust, and you may be familiar in the Windows 11 release, they said you have to have a certain version of a PC to be able to run Windows 11. That was to actually implement a root of trust, and this is something that can start stopping ransomware, for example. So you can always get your system back by pressing the reset button if you've got that version of Windows 11. So that kind of technology is optionally available to the C&I sector. Have not the information to provide whether or not it is actively being selected to be used.
I mean, in terms of the particular program that John referred to, so Professor Goodacre referred to, there was a particular program, Digital Security by Design, which was partially funded by the UKRI, in which ARM created a prototype of taking a high-end processor that you might, for example, have in a high-end server and adding these new technologies in there. And we've made that available to several hundred of the boards associated with this, to many universities and companies in the UK, to allow them to evaluate the technology. And that program is still an ongoing program. We're getting a lot of positive feedback that it can help alleviate quite a number of these issues. There was a very impressive report from Microsoft Research a few years ago that showed that in principle this technology could address some 70% of the issues. And again, so people are looking at how this could be commercially deployed, but at the moment we're not at that stage. We're still at that transition of research towards development.
Talking about security is difficult, isn't it? But are there any particular problems in protecting our national infrastructure by improving cybersecurity?
I think there's two ways to look at the protection of the C&I. The first is what can they do today that they're not doing. So as part of the Digital Security by Design program, I've been hosting a number of workshop panels with members of the critical national infrastructure communities, particularly in energy security and communications telecoms. And what we find is that there's probably a lot of hygiene issues that could be addressed today. So, for example, we were given information, for example, a lot of the control of our infrastructures are in clear text. There's no encryption. It is basically open, non-authenticated, so you don't need passwords even to be able to control what the infrastructure is doing. So those issues should be and could be promoted for addressing today. Now, the second stage to consideration is the digitalisation, the benefits of bringing digital systems and the benefit of the economy, if you like, of digitisation, making sure those are not also then going to be troubled by the 70% of memory safety issues that we talk about here. So there's the immediate, you have to do something to clean up the system today, but as you do that, let's make sure that we do it in a by design and by default manner for the future as well.
I mean, I would observe that security is an arms race. Every time you deal with any problem, the attackers get more sophisticated, and we've seen that progressively at ARM with many forms of attack, and it's very important to also recognise that there is no one magic solution to security. The sort of hygiene factors that John talked about at the start are very prevalent, and the National Cybersecurity Centre put out strong principles for building just the most basic security in, and we put out something called the Platform Security Architecture, which is being driven to also that's got multiple levels that allows people to not have to reinvent the wheel with security, and essentially here is state-of-the-art best practice for that basic hygiene. The sort of by design principles we're talking about builds on top of that, because if you haven't got that basic foundation right, there's no point worrying against these very sophisticated attacks if somebody, for example, is not even using passwords or passing stuff in the clear. So there's a tremendous amount of building on top of some very basic stuff that needs to be done. And the industry is getting better. I think the critical national infrastructure is getting better. And what we're trying to do with programs like the Digital Security by Design program is making sure that when those basics are done, the next steps are also ready for the technology to be deployed.
Do you have a definition of national infrastructure that we're using in the security world? And it's the cooperation between the different parts of national infrastructure.
There are obviously the agencies which regulate our critical infrastructures, and the services. It's primarily, you have to look at the service they're delivering in terms of that definition. They coordinate through the NCSC. They have a program called the CAF, the Cybersecurity Assurance Framework, which basically provides what I would say is a description of what security should look like, and again, they are assessed against that description. Something the committee could consider is, can those descriptions from government move into more prescriptive what you should be doing as opposed to have you done something? And that would be, for example, have you ensured that there's no clear text, unauthenticated access to your systems, for example, as opposed to saying what have you done about access to your systems. So very, very much moving the language that we see in cybersecurity from have you understood your risks, have you understood what your monitoring mechanisms are, through to have you actually done something to protect yourself in the first place. So that's what I think is missing in a lot of the language that we use, both in legislation and recommendation in the frameworks that obviously the Honourable MP was describing there. So, that's something we can do proactively to help against the arms race, as Richard introduced it, is what have you done? What can you do? Have you addressed this issue? So I think that is something that can help with those frameworks.
If I can just pick up the question of what it actually is critical national infrastructure, which I think was your question with great respect, is actually something that I've discussed with the National Cybersecurity Centre, and they've been, I wouldn't say vague, but they've said the exact scope of it is growing. I mean, more and more of our lives are dependent on technology, is things like the mobile phone network part of the national infrastructure? To what extent is having reliable internet connections at your home part of your own infrastructure? Because the way we now interact with the entire society is based on this. So I think one of the things that the NCSC were telling me is don't think just in terms of those critical switches in power stations or stuff like that. That's the easy stuff. Increasingly, we have to recognise that the entirety of society is interacting digitally, interacting online, and so everything is becoming part of the national infrastructure, or else we'll be back in the 1840s and communicating by waving at each other. That means that these technologies for security, we shouldn't think, this only applies to this particular small niche. Increasingly, we need security and secure design principles in all of our technologies.
That must be right, because if you try to say what isn't part of the infrastructure, then you suddenly find it is.
Yeah.
And that takes me to really my final question. Security basically covers everything. You can have excellent cybersecurity, but if something else in the organisation falls down, then you don't have security. And if I can ask Professor Goodacre, you're from Manchester University, which I wish well as a Manchester MP. I mean, is there an overall consideration of security at Manchester University? Because you might get your computers secure, but if one of the bad actors we're talking about here is China. If China withdrew all its students and funding from Manchester University, you would be in a terrible mess, wouldn't you? And are those factors considered as well?
So I would not want to comment on the Manchester University's student employment preferences on that.
It's not employment, it's them being students.
Students.
Being paid for by China.
Yeah. So clearly within the UKRI funding regime, there is a trusted research agenda in terms of recommendation and guidelines on what our academic communities should be doing. And obviously I can forward the references to that if necessary. I would not want to comment further on the choice of students at the university. But
you're not going to say anything. It's not really about the choice. It's about the vulnerability to funding being withdrawn.
So pulling that back into the by design, by default mechanisms, you could view that the systems that are being run should be run in a way that are secured to be by default not dependent on any external influence, whether that's student numbers within the university or whether or not it's the number of connections to computers in the university. The systems themselves should be resilient and integral to the operation they were intended without those external influences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dawn Butler.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both. Professor Goodacre, you said that the government could pivot maybe from developers saying you should do something to have you done it in regards to secure by design. How can we tell whether a developer has considered secure by design?
So this is a very good question, because it is actually very difficult to know if what they have done, say they have done, and what you've got a certification for your PSA, haven't you? So Richard can cover that later, is the idea that you can put trigger points within an implementation to say, let's test it then. So in that regard, you can see it. The other is that it can be down to what tools or what components they have used within the system. And if it's by design, then those components will have delivered that level of security. So, for example, if we were to say, please give me a new energy meter, and you said, which chip has it got in it? Has that got an implementation approach that is PSA certified with by design characteristics, or is it a off-the-shelf chip that does not? Now, clearly, as the vendor, they just have to tell you what chip it is, and you can look it up in a catalogue to know whether or not it's got those design features within them. Right. Okay, so it would be possible to have an audit level at that. Whether or not they turn features on or off, then that's a configurational issue. So I think The other thing, just coming back to the sort of the joint of those two questions, is the security is actually very underpinning to all of the technology priority areas. So when we're talking about government language, I think another area of that is, we talk about the 5 priority areas, for example, AI, semiconductors, biomedical, etc., telecoms. They all require this level of security, and it is actually in many cases common across those as well. So we should see about the language becoming a consistent security underpinning, if you like, of security across the critical aspects, the network, the infrastructures themselves, but also the technology priority areas.
If I could add, I think one of the areas, and I've got regular contacts with the NCSC, and one of the things we've been discussing there is about having clearer provenance of the materials inside your chips. Many people think a chip is a nice small thing, but in reality there are literally billions of transistors and component blocks that are being brought in from multiple different places. In some cases they're being brought in from an open source community where the provenance may not be clear, and there are some concerns that, for example, people might bring in a piece of a design for a chip that has been made in China without anyone actually knowing what's in it. So I think one of the areas that's very important, particularly in the C&I space, is to be able to have a clear provenance of where all of the individual components inside a chip come from. You can look up a catalogue and say this has been built by a reputable US company or a UK company, but actually that might have been assembled from a whole bunch of different collections of intellectual property that have been brought together. And security is always depends on the weakest link. So if there is one little part of that that's wrong, then it could actually compromise overall security. So that provenance story for critical national infrastructure is a really important part of it. And ARM has been talking for the last couple of years with the NCSC about creating a scheme to try and make that clearer and be able to talk. People talk in software about a bill of materials. I think nowadays chips are so complicated and made of so many different components, there needs to be a bill of materials for actually what's inside your chips as well.
Okay, and how far away are we from sort of systematically making sure that happens, that we can trace the provenance of each?
There's still work to be done. I mean, a lot of this...
Very diplomatic?
Sorry?
It's very diplomatic.
Well, I think the first step in any journey is to understand what the potential problems are. And I think, again, I'm very aware that when I say to people, I design chips, they say, what are those tiny little things? That can't be very difficult, can it? It takes 300 people a year to design a modern processor. There's an awful lot of complexity. They are tens to hundreds of millions of pounds worth of activity to create such a thing. So, but because this is not particularly well recognised, and the fact that they are actually being assembled from components from other places, then making people aware of the scope for a problem. And ARM has been doing a lot of work with both the NCSC and with agencies in the US to raise some of the concerns here. And we're starting to see governments go, yes, this is something we need to put into place. Standards as to how you report this stuff. It's all very well, we can write down exactly what we've done in our stuff.
Fair enough.
But you actually need standards so people can say, I bought this, I want to compare it with that. And that standardization process requires standards bodies, people like NIST in the US and people at the NCSC in the UK to push those standards through. Brilliant. Those conversations are happening, but we're not yet at that point.
Thank you. My final question. Professor Goodacre, what is a Digital Security by Design Challenge Fund? What is that, and what's it?
Yeah, so this was something that actually Richard and I both kicked off in ARM in 2018 when I worked at ARM. And it was Richard had identified some fairly good research at Cambridge University. So this is where we're seeing the UK's excellence in academic research coming through, that could change the way that one of these chips runs the software so that it can protect the user both against the memory safety errors, but also, I'm sure you've seen in the press recently, this supply chain attack that could have really done some really bad things to a lot of systems. It also has the technology that could have addressed that. So we proposed into
a bit more about that.
I'm sorry?
Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so the technology this cherry that I mentioned earlier, it's a research technology that ARM basically took to prototype with a product called Morello, not a product, sorry, a research vehicle called Morello, so that we could take it out to the broader community, those hundreds of boards that we've been sharing. And what we're finding is that technology, as described, will block those memory safety issues. These are things that you're probably seeing a lot of reports coming out of America in terms of we can't accept any more memory safety issues. This is something that we can clearly allow our government to do as well. It's is it socially acceptable still to allow that 70% of vulnerabilities, allowing ransomware into our systems, if we know now that you can actually address that? Another aspect of that technology is it can put aspects of the design in what we call isolation, in boxes, so that it can't get out. So even if that code in that box has a supply chain vulnerability in it, it can't affect the rest of your system. Okay, so it's a very technical aspect of doing it, and what you can do then as an integrator or designer of a system, you can have more confidence. What you're doing is you're de-risking your cybersecurity of your product by using it's called compartmentalization, a nice big long word, but basically putting bits of code in boxes that you are not 100% sure, you don't want to be 100% sure that the provenance of that code may have had a supply chain attack. Put it in a box, talk to it very precisely. It can't then go and read your PIN codes and your passwords, which is what happens today. You just have one vulnerability in your application and it has access to all of your data. So this is a mechanism in the technology which stops that. So this program was basically funded by the then industrial strategy. This was the key aspect to that was actually it allowed a challenge to exist. So this is again something that Innovate UK ran about, I think it was 18 of them. These were major investments, probably 50 to 200 million size. The DSDB one was a 70 million investment from the government. That was backed at the time by 117 million of industry money. We've already recognised at that point 144 million, and we're on track to actually recognising around 220 million of industrial co-investment against that government's initial 70. Because in essence, it is a very interesting programme to many companies, and I'm sure we'll get into why it isn't commercially taking off at this point. But what the programme did is it worked with ARM through a project to create this prototype. We then ensured we broke a market failure between... It takes years to build new hardware. Software churns every 6 months. So if software doesn't have a piece of hardware, it ain't going to write the software. And if the hardware doesn't have some software available, they ain't going to build the chip. So basically what the government's challenge fund did was coordinate those two communities together, made them large enough that we could then evaluate, does this technology actually address the questions that we think it does? I think we can say it has, and we've had some fairly large demonstrators from various industries. We've got 34 projects across the community, but also another 40 SMEs have been involved in there as well. We've built a skills group basically from the half dozen scientists up to probably around 500 skilled engineers now that critically know how by design technologies work. So a fairly significant uplift in what we've got in the community in the UK now, and obviously that's now having the international effects as well on the demand. So that's what the programme has been. Where we're at the moment, we're looking at obviously the end of the ISCF funding challenge in March 25. And at the moment, with the uncertainty of spending review and things, actually, we've got a challenge to make sure that we can still support it through to the adoption aspects that I think everybody agrees needs to happen, but it's going to require recommendations from the committees such as yourselves that says, look, we have to understand this is a underpinning across our critical target priority sectors that needs to be addressed in its own manner so that all of our digital infrastructures can be secured, not just how do we make an AI secure, how do we make a telecom secure. This is beneath that, it's across all of the underpinnings. So basically anything that you consider digital today has got a computer chip in it. Okay, and if that computer chip is vulnerable to the exploitation of mistakes that programmers make in software, and I can tell you there's no tools and no human that's perfect. Okay, so they are there. Let's contain those errors. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a significant part of the risk and de-risking of cybersecurity.
Very comprehensive. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just to follow that up in terms of our recommendations, and I should declare that I set up the Industrial Strategy Challenge to which this pertains, but just explain why it requires public funding, why it isn't, in a very commercial world, why it isn't achievable through private investment.
The DSDB challenge was proposed basically to overcome a market failure where no single industry had the either coordinating or financial interest or ability to address that market failure. So in that regard, it was ARM, Microsoft, Google, Amazon.
Those were the public.
They were the public ones that we had in there, and obviously supported by NCSC, etc. Basically saying, government, help us here. It's a big problem. So does
that market failure, as you put it, persist?
The one we addressed, which was the hardware-software market failure, I believe that's been overcome. Okay, and the one we're now looking at and struggling with is the next one, which is the commercial viability of the supply chain to adopt this technology. So what I mean by that is that a company as ARM, although it sells, 30 billion processors last year?
Yes, order of.
Okay, that's the breadth of the digital ecosystem. Which company has an influence on 30 billion? There's probably 2 or 3 in the world that have a significant chunk of that. But in essence, if you want to get the 30 billion, then it's a market failure because there isn't the commercial return on investment in the supply chain to allow that trigger to cause it. So whether or not it's policy, regulation, social responsibility, or whatever that trigger or financial incentive, you have to look at the market as a whole. It's not a telecoms problem. It's not a biomed problem. It's not an AI problem. It's a problem to all of them.
But if you just wanted to, could you do it rather than through investing public money, as we did in that challenge fund? Could you do it through regulation requiring this if you're to participate in the UK
I think you
market?
still need a coordinating function, and clearly there are still aspects of the innovation required. So, it's not a done deal at this stage. It is a concept which has been proven to answer the demands. It's not something that is commercially ready just to say, please buy it.
Perhaps briefly, Mr. Grisenthwaite would just comment on that from a commercial point of view.
I mean, from a commercial point of view, the reality is, and I think I've alluded to the costs of designing a new processor are very substantial. And because of that, we have to, as a commercial company, direct our resources to the most commercially lucrative opportunities. That's the nature of a business. The challenge is that security is not something that people see as they see it as a hygiene factor, not as a reason to buy something new to a certain extent. And certainly in consumer devices, I will predict that nobody around here has bought a new phone because they thought, my one's not secure enough, I must get a new phone. As well as that. You may well have bought yourself a new phone because you want higher performance or a better camera or things like that. But the security is actually a very difficult thing to go and sell. And so we are working on how the major software ecosystems, that's things like the Google Android operating system in your phones or the Linux operating system in big servers, can really make this an attractive feature that people actually will say, I want to have this device. It will be worth spending some more on because adding these new features will cost more money because they take more transistors and that's just the way it works. There's more area on the silicon. And so there needs to be a reason that people can say, I will pay extra for this feature. And that market failure is that it's not necessarily seen as particularly attractive that I will have something that's secure by design. for a lot of commercial devices.
I see.
So if we pull that specifically into the critical national infrastructure scenario, you could legislate you must use it, but they would not be able to buy it.
Right.
Okay, so that's the problem that's got to be overcome.
Okay, just before I go to Stephen Metcalfe, just to follow up something, the exchange that you had with Dawn Butler on the provenance of components, Mr. Grisenthwaite. Is it the case that you described the kind of complexity and just the sheer number of different components? Is it possible at this stage to exclude, for example, components from China for most of these modern applications?
Well, I think at the moment it's a design decision by the companies building a. If somebody is building a chip for, let us say, a telecoms application, they'll design some parts themselves and they'll take off-the-shelf components from various sources. Yeah. At the moment, there is no particular guidance or requirement that the source of those is reported, and because all of these are companies, people will tend to buy or access materials from the cheapest possible source. Yeah. That's just how business works. So as a result, you're kind of left with people pulling together these components in order to make, say, an advanced telecoms chip, to take the example I'm using. Now, at the end of the day, that will get sold under the name of whichever company has made that chip, and people won't necessarily know where those things came from. There's no obligation whatsoever to report that. There's no knowledge about where things come from. So essentially, this stuff can almost get hidden in. So the fundamental premise is, should you report where you get your IP from, so that at least people can see what's happening, and that will be a start of it. And then, to a certain extent, you can have certification schemes on top of that.
That is not in place at the moment. So this would be a huge undertaking.
No.
I mean, it's the equivalent in agriculture of being able to kind of trace a piece of meat back to the animal on the farm that it was reared. I mean, that's taken quite a long time in agriculture, and it's fairly simple. And in this case, it's a kind of vast undertaking.
It's a relatively. I think it's tractable because I think you can identify various principles as to which things are more security vulnerable or less security vulnerable in terms of the various components, and make a start in that direction. And there's a technology called firewalling, where you can essentially firewall off, segment off some of the less trustworthy materials and provide principles. So we've put in some suggestions to the NCSC about how you could start in a scheme in this direction. But, it may take a lot of time to do it, but I think if that shouldn't be a reason not to do it. It's just time.
That way that you describe to identify some components that are more security vulnerable, is that robust enough? Could you not? But to kind of interact with all the other components.
If you surround that by technologies that limit what it's able to do, you can constrain its ability to cause harm. And that compartmentalization is something hardware can do relatively straightforward, in much as you can do in software with the technologies that John was talking about as well. So there are techniques, and again, there are principles that you can write down to say, identify, these are the areas that have to be from a known provenance. These are the areas which, if you firewall them off using this sort of technique, could be from a less trustworthy source. And again, the fundamental thing, the first step is to document what you've done so that people can then audit it. So if you are a government agency saying, I want to buy something for my secure communication system in the MOD, I know exactly what's in that. And at the moment, again, the lack of transparency, I think, is a significant challenge.
And to be clear, so this is about the future. At the moment, I mean, this committee had an inquiry into 5G, and the government, as you know, took a decision to exclude Huawei from from that, indeed. And other countries like Australia, I think, have been more comprehensive in as they claim and say, excluding Huawei. But the point is that without that knowledge of the kind of provenance at the moment, it's impossible to say whether or not there is componentry somewhere there that is from this source now.
I think there is a risk there. I wouldn't want to overstate it, but it's a risk that I think is only going to get worse. Our geopolitical times are getting more complicated. The opportunities are there. We're seeing people submarining in technologies into open source software, which is something that Professor Goodacre alluded to a little bit earlier. There's been some reports of that. The same concepts could exist in hardware, and what we're trying to do is think ahead to how can we start protecting against this. And this ties in with what I said a little bit earlier, which is that there's an awful lot of poor hygiene and security, and this whole thing we have to think of as a set of principles built on top of each other. A lot of people are fixing those basics. We're thinking about what's next, what are the next possible attacks.
I'm sorry to delay, Stephen, but Graham wants to come in.
Obviously, we've decided to be very wary enough to exclude Huawei and be wary about Volvo cars made in China or electric cars made in China. But I have no idea of the market in chips. Are the Chinese feeding chips into an overall market so that you don't know what they are? My ignorance was that people wouldn't be buying Chinese chips, but can you tell me what percentage of the market?
I can't. We can give a written response as to our understanding of the market, because I don't have that data.
That would be very interesting.
But at a more general level, it's a very globalized industry. There are an awful lot of different types of chips. There are tiny little power controllers. There are chips that do the big processing. The bit that I'm actually highlighting is the bits that do the big processing, the thing that makes your phone do all the clever stuff that your phone does, is actually a combination of lots of, we call them IP blocks. They're little subcomponents of design, and that's actually the basis of ARM's business, is selling these, but other people sell them as well. And you can get them through open source as well. And the provenance of even those parts of chips, not even chips themselves, is actually what I'm concerned about. I think the reality is that there's an awful lot of semiconductors and chips made in China, that is part of the global supply chain that exists, and that's part of the reason why you're seeing things like the CHIPS Act in the US and in Europe looking to bring more capability into more friendly nations, and that's the basis of the UK strategy. I sit on the Semiconductor Advisory Panel, and as part of that, we are thinking in terms of working with like-minded nations to ensure, again, better supply chains, because it is the global system is breaking down because of the changing geopolitics.
Okay. Thank you. I think Dawn wants to come in quickly.
Yeah, sorry, Stephen. Just very quickly, we've taken evidence, and we were about 20 years behind China in the development of chips and microprocessors. And I know you've got over 100 patents on microprocessors. I just wondered, how close are we to catching up?
I'm not sure I recognise that 20 years. I think it depends on what exactly you're looking at. In terms of the designs of microprocessors, which is the brains of a phone or a brains of a server, I think ARM's implementations are being demonstrated as being absolutely leading edge. The manufacturing side, it's different. The UK doesn't have its own manufacturing base, and I'm not necessarily sure it needs to, but we do need to make sure that we've got access to manufacturing in trustworthy countries.
I thought the Five Eyes were working together to have a manufacturing base.
That is the direction of travel, yes.
So we're not there yet.
Well, there is the majority of chips in the world today, the leading edge chips, the so-called 2 nanometer or 3 nanometer, which are the smallest geometries, the most advanced chips, are basically built in 3 places in the world. Some in America, some in South Korea, and the vast majority in Taiwan. And Taiwan presents a strategic risk going forward because of the geopolitical tensions.
Great, thank you.
There.
But if you look at that, that's the printer. The artist is in the UK. So we draw the pictures, they print them. Now clearly they can change the printing, and that's where Richard was talking about knowing the provenance of the components. But in essence, they have the leading printer, but we've got the leading artists.
Good analogy. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify that last point about Taiwan. Taiwan at the moment is a friendly nation.
It
to the
is,
UK.
but
it's the risk that
there is risk there.
of where it
Apologies.
might be in the future that could disrupt the supply chain. So, I think a lot of what I wanted to discuss has been already answered. But the first question was really around the Challenge Fund, which you've discussed quite clearly. But it does sound like when the Challenge Fund was set up, there was a clear path that you wanted to follow. Was that a constraint, or was it sort of agreed amongst the wider community that this was the challenge, this is what we wanted to explore, please go away and do that?
So the challenge bid itself asked for a bit more money than it was received, so that we could look more at the adoption side. Now, clearly what we did as a group of stakeholders, an advisory group that includes a lot of government players as well, was prioritise what is the essential bits that must be fixed, otherwise adoption doesn't work. And that was what we addressed. So we focused on the breaking market failure between availability of hardware and software to evaluate whether the technology answers the problems. We then, in the vision, if you like, said, and we'll test it in 2 or 3 sectors. Now, we've actually tested it in 6.
Right.
So we've done VPN in telecoms, we've done 2 automotives, we've done e-commerce through a very large UK company called the Hut Group, where they've been looking at how securing e-commerce on the internet. I can't remember the others, but there's a couple of other ones there that sort of then said, yes, this is actually finding things that we didn't anticipate at the beginning. The other thing we did was we constrained the funds to make sure we did that really well on the Morello scenario. We have more recently extended that to include the RISC-V architecture as well. So the technology that we're describing is patent-free. So any architecture, there's basically 3 in the world that you should care about: the x86 one, the ARM architecture, and the RISC-V one. So the programme was able to extend to include RISC-V in terms of what does this look like there, and can we do anything on that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. That is very helpful. I mean, I think the subtext of that was, had you had a bit more money, you might have been able to do a bit more, or the scope might have been a bit wider, but it wasn't. It didn't hamper your...
It didn't hamper proving the technology works, and obviously thanks to ARM for working with us on that. We are the coordinator of this, and we are not the doers.
Yeah.
And I would stress that the Morello chips and boards that are out there are a resource that researchers can carry on using and will carry on using. Obviously, funding researchers in order to do that, particularly in universities, would be a good thing, because it's not like after 5 years everything's solved. There's more software investigations that can be done. We're seeing growing interests actually from within US government to look at it. So I've got a meeting with the ONCD, which is part of the White House, looking at national cyber issues coming up, and they're asking about access to the Morello system, simply so that, again, they can understand the values of this technology and what they could do, because this is a completely global industry. There's no point Britain trying to secure its bit and not having the US involved. Most of the software on your phones and your systems, a lot of it comes from the US as well as the UK.
So the challenge is not so much what we did with the funding we had in that period. It's now more the long-term commitment and extending that now to actually move beyond what we've got. So how do we, in this case, influence DCIT to prioritise in UKI, for example, the focusing of security principles across the technology areas for the next phase that is now the challenge, so that we can move it beyond it works, to actually get it into a critical infrastructure.
Do you want to put a figure on that?
Well, what I can say is that the current programme, like I say, was 70 to that. If we were to judge whether or not we wanted, for example, let's take energy resilience of the new EV meters or the constraint management of things that they're going through, led by Desnes, the implementation of the security of that. Why don't we pre-product procure an end-to-end scenario for that? And then that's probably the high tens. Now, if you want to be able to extend that to multiple markets, it's probably another high 10. So around the 100 level would not be unusable.
Thank you very much. And just an inquiry from me. You talked about, I think ARM has 30 billion, or supplies 30 billion chips last year.
We don't provide any chips. We sell designs that other companies
that created 30 billion chips.
I haven't got that. I haven't got actually last year's number on my finger. Over our lifetime, we've shipped just under 300 billion chips.
300 billion.
So, and the majority of that has been in the last few years. So that number's not inconsistent with.
Just so that we can all understand the scale of the chip market, is there a figure of how many chips globally are produced?
I think again, we've already undertaken to take a certain amount of written responses because I'm not an expert. If you look at, I think you've got to be very careful about chips. There are memory chips. There are lots of different types. If we talk about processing chips, I mean, clearly things like high-end mobile phones and so on, we know there are several billion of those made a year, and so that is several billion processing chips, and that's actually one of the biggest markets for high-end processing. Servers is a much smaller market, but they have more chips in them. But that 300 billion is also inflated by the fact that there are lots of very small microcontrollers in things that like control your electric windows in your car or your windscreen wipers. So it's an incredibly wide market. The overall industry, I think McKinsey have a figure at the moment of it's round about a $500 billion industry, expected to go up to about $1 trillion by 2030. So that gives an idea of and that's the semiconductor industry as a whole. And that probably gives you an idea of the scope of it.
Right. I mean, I was quite surprised, and I finished chairman, that when there was a disruption following COVID to global supply chains and you couldn't get a car for love nor money and second-hand cars went through the roof, was that part of that was the lack of supply of chips. And I was informed at the time that an average-ish high-end car would use 5,000 chips and some would use 10,000 chips.
And those numbers are going up.
Hence the doubling by 2030.
Well, yes, and the complexity is going up as well because clearly there's a lot of interest in things like AI at the moment. Your cars are starting to be able to steer themselves, drive themselves. We're providing technologies that do all of that processing. They take a lot of work and chips.
And as the cars start to drive themselves, we need to make sure they're secure. On that,
yes, please.
Thank you, Stephen. Finally, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Mr. Grisenthwaite, can you tell us a little bit more about the Morello board approach and how it makes systems more resilient to cyber attacks? Well,
so the Morello board is a board that contains a chip which has been augmented with technologies based on this fundamental research done by Cambridge University, which they call CHERRY, which stands for Capability Hardware Enhanced Risk Instructions. What that does is that for each reference to memory, it carries alongside that some additional information to essentially restrict it to only being able to refer to the things you want it to refer to. Because the memory safety issues that are at the heart of some 70% of vulnerabilities, those memory safety issues really come into classes such as when I try and access, I will have an array of data, a set of data, which I want to pick something out of. For example, look up your name in a database. But what people are able to do, malicious programmers find ways of exploiting that, so it goes out of range and picks up some other piece of data that it's not meant to get hold of. And that actually then can be used not only if you're reading data but also writing it to then corrupt the way that it's executing, and then you can take over your computer and do bad things. That's the basis of these attacks. By constraining what you can, by carrying alongside references to memory, what constraints with it in a single package, you are then able to essentially defeat that class of attack. And that then becomes a building block to deal with a great many of the memory safety issues that are there. In addition, because of that very tight containment of information, you're then able to use this as a way to do a better compartmentalization of your software, which is what John was talking about a little bit earlier, which what that does is, because software, much as I was talking about hardware before, software is actually made up of lots of different libraries of material that come from lots of different people. People will write something to handle your pictures or to handle your email or whatever. And what you want is, if something goes wrong in the thing that's rendering, displaying your pictures, you don't want that to be able to access your email. And so by having stronger compartment boundaries, which is what this technology allows you to do, it then means that even if there are exploits that are found, there's less damage, there's less ability to take over the whole device. And again, a single exploit being the basis by which you can take over the whole device is unfortunately the situation we're in today, and that better compartmentalization is very important.
Professor Goodacre.
So obviously Richard's very nicely articulated the technical merits of the Morello. I think you should also understand that it is a demonstrational platform. It is not something that anybody can go and buy. It's not something that a consumer can use to protect them in the ways that Richard described. So that's really the status. We've used the demonstrational platform with all these great features to prove to people and show people that these benefits can be realised. But the challenge that we all have now is, how do we get together to, either through regulations, the policy, the recommendations, the guidelines, the frameworks, interventions into that, procurement through to that, to basically de-risk as much of the cyber security risk of the UK, if you like, the national security in some cases. How do we get the commercial answers to be put forwards, taking Morello into product moving forwards?
And I can explain why that challenge exists. What we provide essentially is a building block. There are lots of software engineers that spend their lives writing software. They need to be able to use these new building blocks, these new tools, to be able to create that more secure world that John's talking about. And to a certain extent, it takes time for software engineers to work out the right way of using these building block tools to come up with it, and to come up with a compelling story that says this will really still give everything that people want from their phone or from their server or whatever else, and can be more secure. And that's the step that we're still going through. And there's some great demonstrations being put together by Cambridge University, by ourselves, that show this, but it's taking more time to port software because software is so complicated to make use of this technology.
Thank you. And a very brief question for Professor Goodacre. How does the potential uncertainty of Innovate UK's Digital Security by Design Challenge Funds post-2025 impact long-term planning, both for investment strategies and research in improving cybersecurity for critical national infrastructure?
So again, the DSDB programme through Innovate UK has been a coordinating function. So in other words, we are the ones that pulled the software, the hardware, the researchers. Again, part of the Industrial Strategy Fund, we also included social scientists, economic people. So it's been a very cross-disciplinary approach to that. I would say that it's not clear how those approaches could pick up the ecosystem, those 500 skilled staff and trajectory, the maturity of that software. How do we sustain that over the spending review? Very, very pertinent question. And then how do we then execute, or can we execute on the adoption and diffusion of the technology in terms of beyond that? And that's the question I'm sure you're all very familiar with in the latter half of this year and the start of next calendar year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Just a final question from me to Professor Goodacre. You're a professor at the University of Manchester. Not far down the road from you, down in Cheshire, is the Hartree facility, run by the Science and Technology Facilities Council, in which there's been an announcement that there's a new Lenovo Chinese-made supercomputer that is to be installed there, to be used by, amongst other people, Rolls-Royce and the UK Atomic Energy Authority. Kieran Martin, former head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, who's given evidence to this inquiry, was quoted as saying that this raises important strategic and national security questions. What is your instinct about your neighbouring facility?
I don't think, unfortunately, I'm equipped to answer, not an expert in the selection of HPC systems. I have worked with Hartree previously, and in fact, they have one of my prototype exascale supercomputers sat in their car park that I was using as part of my research as well. So I know that they work diligently towards what is acceptable for their use and market, but apart from that, I cannot comment on the system. It is obviously using standard components in regards of processing capability, because there are only a limited number of vendors that provide those components.
Mr. Grisenthwaite, we've had a conversation about provenance. I mean, if it's a computer that is made in China, we can be pretty clear about its provenance. What is the point of doing this kind of great exercise in sort of finding out where things come from if such procurement happens anyway?
I obviously can't talk about procurement policies or what due diligence was done on that. In terms of why I think provenance matters is that I think we need to be aware of where things come from so that people can make informed choices and informed decisions. I think ignorance and lack of transparency is the point where you wake up and discover, oh my goodness, things are actually much worse than we realised. And that transparency, I think, is desperately important if we're going to have the ability to do a proper audit of our systems going forward.
Well, thank you. You've made that point very clearly and compellingly, and thank you both for your evidence this morning. I'm now going to invite the next pair of witnesses to join us at the table. Thank you very much indeed. As they take the seats, I will introduce them. And I'm pleased to welcome Henry Harrison, who is the co-founder and Chief Scientist of Garrison Technology Limited, which is a British cybersecurity company specialising in translating security solutions developed for national security purposes to commercial applications. So I'd be very interested to hear from you, Mr. Harrison, and also Dr. Vasilios Mavroudis, who is the Principal Research Scientist and co-theme lead for AI for Cyber Defence at the Alan Turing Institute. Thank you very much indeed, both, for joining us. Perhaps I could start with a question to Dr. Mavroudis, and tell us about how artificial intelligence is being used both defensively and offensively in cybersecurity. Obviously relevant to this inquiry, but we also have a parallel inquiry into AI. So we're very interested in your thoughts on that.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today. So machine learning has been traditionally used in cybersecurity in the context of critical national infrastructure, but not only, protecting also retail and commercial systems that are not part of this infrastructure. So the security industry have been typically quite conservative with regards to how complex the machine learning models they employ are. And this for a good reason. We need those systems to be explainable, easy to audit and understand. So as we move towards more complicated models, which are the models we see on the headlines in newspapers, all those processes become harder. So in terms of on the defense side, we've been using machine learning for anomaly detection, intrusion detection, and malicious software detection in systems. This is usually in combination with even more basic systems, for example, detecting malicious signatures or behaviors. Besides that, there is also there is the offensive side. which is a concern. Right now, phishing attacks, which are social engineering attacks, usually on high-value individuals, have been on the rise, and it seems that the latest advancements with language models will propel this further. So these are two of the, let's say, use cases for defense and offense. There is a third area which is more on the research side, but it seems to be gaining traction lately, and it has to do with automated vulnerability discovery and patching, which is fixing essentially. This has not made it yet to commercial products to the extent we would expect to see it, but it seems that latest research work suggests that in the next few years we will have something on that area.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me turn to my colleagues for some questions, starting with Stephen Metcalfe and then Dawn Butler.
Thank you very much indeed. Someone in our previous panel mentioned that effectively this is an arms race. You take one step, the bad actors will try and combat that. Part of the problem, though, is the pace of change is ever increasing as well, and we have lots of new emerging technologies that are now taking hold. Do you feel that the operators of our critical national infrastructure understand the cybersecurity risks that these new technologies present? Who would like to go first?
Henry? I obviously don't seek to represent the entirety of the UK's critical infrastructure sector, but I do think that it's important when you look at this there's a useful analogy that I've relied on through my career in security, which is to think of the problem of you and your friend out for a walk being chased by a bear, and you have two strategies available to you. One is to try and outrun the bear, and the other is to try and outrun your friend. And those two strategies are indeed employed in different contexts, and a large number of the mainstream commercial world is really focused on trying to outrun the friend rather than to outrun the bear. And so my world spans both of these because I deal both with commercial companies, but I also deal with the national security sector. And obviously, if our agencies who are trying to protect our secret and top secret information took the view they're only trying to outrun their friend, we as citizens would not be terribly pleased with them. And they clearly are trying to outrun the bear rather than the friend. I may have drawn this metaphor to its final conclusion here. So does everybody understand everything? No, but then not everybody is trying to understand everything. And if you want to ask the question about the real understanding, who has that information that really answers, you really do need to look to the agencies in the UK and in our allied partner nations in terms of the deepest understanding of what actually works and what doesn't work in these areas.
Okay. But as it stands, you think there is enough understanding of the risk? I think
that the risk is phrased very differently, right? I think if you talk to, I had a conversation with the CEO of a major financial organisation some time back, sorry, I apologise, the chairman, who said that their ambition from a cybersecurity risk management was to be in the upper quartile. In other words, that's very clearly about a comparative, trying to avoid being the laggards that are caught out by people going after the weakest. And that's very different, as I say, from those who say, no, we have very clearly defined adversaries, foreign nation states, and we need to understand what it takes to defend against them when they're coming after us specifically.
Okay, thank you. Do you agree with that entirely?
I do. I have something small to add in that through interactions and even interviews we've conducted with CNI operators, people at NCSC who are close to national infrastructure. Overall, the stance they've been keeping seems to be very healthy in that they're curious, they're learning about what's coming out without necessarily jumping quickly into using the latest and greatest, which often we don't understand very well.
Okay, very good. And are they working with their supply chain adequately as well to ensure that the sort of whole ecosystem is knowledgeable and working to reduce potential risk?
So the supply chain risks for machine learning come from the hardware, which I would say I personally consider relatively safe. The bigger risk comes with adopting pre-trained models from third parties that might not have the security you might expect, or those models getting intercepted on the way to your premises by, again, a state-level adversary potentially, and embedding a hidden functionality into them. The problem, again, is that those models, if we're talking about advanced AI models, are hard to audit, so once this functionality is embedded in them, it's usually hard to discover it.
If I might just add a little bit about the supply chain. The cybersecurity industry is a very large, very well-funded industry with a lot of capital being invested constantly in new technologies that are being developed. It is also an industry where the vast majority of buyers don't have the skills, the information, or the time to assess whether those technologies are actually effective at protecting against cybersecurity risk. And consequently, I have read studies that suggest that the cybersecurity industry spends more on marketing as a percentage of revenue than any other industry on the planet. And the previous technical director of NCSC described many of the offerings in the cybersecurity technology market as no better than magic amulets. And the current chief technology officer of the NCSC has described the market as broken. So where this, as I've said, there's a very big difference between the mainstream market and the market where we are looking to protect the things that the UK has determined really matter, which have historically been classified secrets, and where very significant work goes on between the NCSC or their partners in the NSA or CSE and other allies to look at the technology and work with the suppliers in order to assess whether those are really secure, and that doesn't apply to the vast majority of the security market.
So how do we address that? I mean, does the government need to invest in this? Is it government? Is it market?
I think yes. I think the problem is this is a very large global problem. I think you heard from your previous givers of evidence that secure by design is obviously there are a great many initiatives in there, but speaking as the representative of a private sector company, we are under extreme commercial pressure. And if nobody is marking your homework, there is an overwhelming incentive to cheat. It's very, very easy to stand up and say, I do fantastic technology, I'm secure by design, this will protect you against anything. But to actually evidence that is very difficult. And because this is a global market, I think that the UK has to see this as a way where it's going to have to work with its allies to address, rather than something where the UK can expect to resolve the problem unilaterally.
Okay. So just thinking on that challenge further, I mean, the UK does have a history of having quite good, or the ability to create quite good standards and regulations and quality marks. Is that an area where we could potentially work on while working with our global partners, leading the way with them and finding some sort of accreditation system?
So I think there is activity underway. So the area I work in is an area called cross-domain solutions, and we are a type of solution that's designed specifically historically for protecting classified, things that really, really matter. Yeah. The UK is the recognised world leader in this space. At the US government's conference on cross-domain solutions last year, on the second of 2 days, all but one of the speakers was British. The NCSC has been doing some fantastic work on looking at how homework marking can be done for that sector, but I think that there is a great deal of work to do in terms of publicising and helping people to understand about this, because at the moment the knowledge, whilst not classified, is very restricted in terms of the distribution that it's found.
Okay, thank you. If you were to encourage us to make a recommendation to the government about where it should spend some money, is that where you would think it should go?
Yes.
Or is it in greater understanding of the relationship between emerging technologies and cybersecurity?
So I'm a salesman, right? So obviously you must take everything that I say, as with any vendor, with understanding that I have an interest in this. But I do think that we are in a situation where the UK is absolutely the recognised world leader in the area of how to protect against high-end nation-state cyber attacks, and we are doing insufficient work to shout about that on the global stage and to advertise our world leadingness.
Is there anything you want to add at all?
I want to bring attention to another area that is often overlooked and has to do with startups working on something that is not necessarily critical national infrastructure by the strict definition of it. For example, we have startups in Oxford working on nuclear fusion reactors. Now, I'm not a nuclear physicist. From what I know, there is no risk of leaking radiation if something goes wrong, but this comes with a lot of innovation. It would be great for the nation if we had a breakthrough there. So perhaps support for those startups, first to protect their secret and then from espionage potentially, and second from potentially malicious intrusions to their systems for destruction of property, which will definitely set their research and processes several years behind.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Dawn Butler and then James Davis.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both. We're always saying that we are world leaders in everything in the UK, often. And I'm just wondering, Mr. Harrison, do you think we should be investing more in not just, as we heard earlier, the analogy, not just the drawing, the creating of the art, but the printing of it?
So, speaking, I mean, I think it's not quite. That was a very good analogy, I think, at the time. But it is, of course, more complex than that, and there are, in fact, multiple levels in this process. So, for example, my company does indeed manufacture hardware. So we have UK-based manufacturing, and we ship physical units of a certain size to our customers in the UK and overseas. But we don't, of course, manufacture every element inside that box, and some of those are chips that we purchase from elsewhere. So I don't think I can comment on UK as a whole, but I can say that it is possible to build businesses in the UK that do manufacture technology, not only design technology, and we do that.
I think it's important, isn't it, if we're going to be confident about the provenance of all the components. Thank you very much. Excuse me. Doctor, I'm really sorry. I've got a bit of a cold. How do you think artificial intelligence, how do you think it's being created with secure by design as part of it? Because I find what I like about the Alan Turing Institute is that it always kind of holds that ethical approach at the core whenever I read the briefings. So I'm just wondering, like, how or do you think, artificial intelligence is being delivered with secure by design approach?
Fantastic question, and a really difficult one to answer thoroughly. I'll do a best effort though. So the problem with machine learning right now is that we're aiming for performance, so we're optimizing for that, so the best model that can deliver the best performance, and alignment with humanity's goals perhaps, or security is almost an afterthought. However, in the last few years, because the community has realized that we were lagging behind on that, there has been significant effort into making it part of the training of the model to ensure that it matches certain other properties, one of them being security. Is it perfect? It's not, but we've seen substantial progress towards this goal, and the hope is that we can reach something that is considered acceptable in the real world soon. Another area that we've been making lots of progress is explainability, which has to do more with reasoning as to why the model suggested or did something based on some data. The area on this area is, the research in this area is a little bit lagging behind, particularly due to the complexity of the latest models.
Mm. And is there a global agreement on the standards of security? Because it's a global problem, is there a global agreement on what people would consider, well, yeah, that's secure at level 1, that's secure at level 2? Dr. Mavroudis and then Mr. Harrison.
I would say that although different countries have different standards, with regards to embedding a machine learning model into a system, we don't have to necessarily come up with a whole new set of rules of how we can safely do that. The existing best practices from the cybersecurity industry will suffice to a very large extent. However, in many cases they come, especially when it comes to using AI models as to make decisions, cybersecurity is at odds with usability. So there is some friction there.
Okay.
So I think we have I think you've identified a very large problem in the security industry, which is some sort of calibration scale for security is lacking. I personally would like to see us talking about security in terms of things like differentiating between something that is secure enough to repel a teenager in their bedroom who's willing to spend an afternoon trying to get into it versus something which is secure against a foreign nation state willing to spend $100 million and a year trying to get into it. That would be a useful scale to my mind, but historically nobody's really been willing to put their to opine on that because of the risk of getting it wrong, I think, and also because I think the sorts of people who are capable of making those sorts of technical evaluations are not typically well connected with the process of describing things in terms of money and time that is most useful to decision makers.
Thank you. I think that's an area that we really need to pursue as a committee. We'll probably do more work into that. Should government and operators of critical national infrastructure only use artificial intelligence systems which are designed and deployed securely to avoid harms to individuals and systems? And is that currently possible? I don't know who wants to go first.
I don't really have anything to comment. I'm not an artificial intelligence expert and I can't comment on that.
Could you expand a little bit on...
Basically, when the national infrastructures, should they be designed to avoid harms? So should that be embedded in the system? And is that currently possible?
With regards to machine learning or AI or in general?
In regards to AI.
So absolutely, and this is I would say the end goal of all the efforts in machine learning. However, as I touched on earlier, it is usually pretty difficult if we're talking about advanced models to know exactly what's all the information encoded in the neurons of that model, the parameters. To reduce harm, there are processes that we can add on top of the model. So, for example, there is a standardized process called levels of automation, by which you could have an AI model as part of a more complex system. And it defines how this model gets to influence decisions. For example, you don't have to go directly to autonomous decision-making where the model decides everything on its own, but you could have a human in the loop, either approving the model's suggestions or receiving recommendations from the model without them being binding.
Do you think that human in the loop is enough, or do you think it should be more human-based, or do you think a human in the loop is enough to mitigate any risks?
For use cases where humans are sufficient, I would say we don't have any immediate pressure to switch to using a model, perhaps to reduce costs, but besides that, not. However, there are many cases where adding a machine learning component into an existing system would help us scale it much further, process a lot more data. So in those cases, there is some pressure to move towards systems that are more autonomous than they are right now.
Right, thank you. And my last question, Mr. Harrison, does the UK have all the talent that we need to continue to be world leaders?
Of course, we don't have all the talent that we need. No, I run a company, and of course, everything, I always want more engineers. that are better and cheaper. But actually, we have been very successful over the past 10 years in hiring excellent talent into our engineering organisation. And of course, there have been ups and downs based on the swings in the market. But generally speaking, I have no complaints about the UK as a skills base for what I've been doing in the last 10 years.
And what's the industry doing to encourage and support the next generation of workers?
Well, I think one of the things that we are particularly interested in is supporting the diversity of the next generation of engineers. We still have a very significant issue, particularly with gender diversity in the engineering base that we find. I think this is a global issue, not a uniquely UK issue, but certainly one of the things that we as an organisation have tried to support in the small way that we can is trying to encourage females at school and university to consider careers in science and engineering.
Just quickly, and what does that look like? Like, how do you encourage them in the schools?
I'm afraid that probably I'm not the right person to answer that question, but I'm happy to arrange for us to provide some written evidence to the committee on that.
Thank you both very much. Thank you.
Just to follow up on Dawn's point, there are programs like the STEM ambassadors, for example, where people that are working in science, technology, engineering, maths go into schools and mentor people. Do you participate in that as a company?
We have participated in some of those things, but again, on the details, I'd prefer to supply those as written evidence.
Okay, but as someone that's worked and practiced in the field, you've observed this. You've kind of, as it were, sort of.
I mean, my role above all has been to support the female engineers within my organisation to allow them to go and support these types of things. So I really would like to source the information from them rather than try and represent them.
Well, I don't want to be difficult, but you're the chief scientist for your company, and you express an aspiration to have more people coming through. What can you do in your own job as chief scientist to help and encourage that?
Well, I am a middle-aged white male, right? I mean, like, there's not a lot I can do about that, and consequently, my role, as I say, is above all to support others within my organisation who are better placed than I am to do that sort of outreach work.
Dr. Mavroudis, you work in a related field, which is similarly not as diverse as it could be, and therefore kind of missing people of talent. What do you observe, both in the organisations that you work in and in your personal capacity?
Turing has been very active in working towards improving EDI within our teams and processes. We currently have an intensive program specifically targeting to address this problem for undergraduate students. We've been engaging with students in high school, essentially giving them some insight on what it means to be a researcher, what it means to work in cybersecurity. Besides that, we do our best when hiring to advertise to places that will attract a diverse set of candidates. However, I still feel that we come a little bit late into the chain of events to completely overturn some trends that are there. As hiring as part of our team, for example, most of our researchers have a PhD, so the percentages in terms of perhaps gender balance of the candidates with a PhD in cybersecurity are already quite skewed. So it is hard for us to intervene at that point, although we're doing our best. Another issue we are facing as a team, and we've been being creative addressing, has been hiring people at the intersection of machine learning and security is especially hard. As you can imagine, hiring right now someone who's an expert on AI is very competitive. Not only that, we're looking for someone who has both expertise on this and cybersecurity. There are very few people in the UK and in the world who have this set of skills. So what we're doing instead is we're hiring people with expertise on one of the two areas, typically machine learning, and we upskill them and train them to the other one, which is usually cybersecurity.
Thank you. Do you go personally to kind of visit universities and younger people, perhaps schools even? Is that something you do?
Yes, typically the Turing organizes and makes it easy for us to engage with students. It's usually a day or two off for them in some nice environment where they can engage with many of us from different teams and different groups and different stages in our career, and get insight on what it looks like.
Thank you. James Davis, then Rebecca Longberry.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Harrison, you've already touched on cross-domain solutions, and I know you have a particular interest in it. Could you explain in basic terms what they are and how they work?
Sure. So 20 years ago, if you had computer systems which contained highly sensitive material, typically secret or above secret information, the way you protected them was simply not to connect them to the internet. And what's interesting is I think we haven't done a scientific study of this, but I believe anecdotally that the majority of professionals in the cybersecurity industry believe that still to be the case today. It is largely speaking not the case today because it is not practical to try and run defense or intelligence matters in that way in the 21st century. And so consequently, in fact, today, these sorts of highly sensitive systems are connected to the internet or to other dangerous systems, but they are connected via a class of technology called cross-domain solutions. So that is what the technology is designed to do, is to allow connectivity between highly sensitive systems and highly dangerous systems whilst protecting the highly sensitive systems.
So it's a bit like a very powerful firewall and encryption.
I think that obviously firewalls and encryption are also technologies that have a role in cybersecurity, but there is not necessarily very much in common between them and cross-domain solutions. I think what's interesting about cross-domain solutions, although very few people in the industry have heard of them, you can in fact go onto the NCSC's website where they have published their principles for what constitutes building a good cross-domain solution, and rather than try to represent them, I think I refer anybody to see what the NCSC has to say about it as really the recognised world authority on it.
Okay, and where are they currently deployed?
So typically today, where cross-domain solutions are deployed is precisely for the use case I described, which is around the protection of classified systems containing classified information. I think the really interesting thing is that obviously 20 years ago, that really was very clearly the most sensitive things that the country has, which was classified military and intelligence secrets. But today we worry very much also about critical infrastructure, where the issue is not secrecy, but the continued and correct operation of those things.
Yes.
And what we see is that there's been very little knowledge about the existence or the role that cross-domain solutions could play within those who are discussing the security of critical infrastructure as opposed to the protection of secrets.
Yes, and so why is that the case? Why is there such poor awareness?
Again, if we go back 20 years ago, there was poor awareness because the information was classified itself, and so there was meant to be poor awareness. Yeah. That has changed recently, and I think about 3 or 4 years ago, the NCSC took the decision to publish detailed guidance about cross-domain solutions on its website. But whilst we've seen a kind of a bottom-up information about technical information about cross-domain solutions, what we haven't seen is any sort of top-down communication that emphasises the importance of understanding about this. And that's something that I would heartily commend the country to do.
I know Becky has some follow-up questions, but Dr. Mavroudis, do you have any additional points to add to what I've raised?
I want to add something on the point of secrecy that Mr. Harrison made. Secrecy is perhaps necessary in some cases, and no one is going to argue against that, but it's hurting research in another way. Typically the machine learning community made huge advancements in the last few years just by being very open with their data sets, their challenges, their benchmarks. So even putting things up on the internet and allowing individuals around the world to take a chance, try their approach, see if it works, and share it with everyone. We're having the problem that it's becoming increasingly hard, or it's typically hard for us to do the same, just because a lot of those things are classified. There is a way forward, though, which is identifying the underpinning problems and stripped from all the technical details that might be indeed confidential, share with the world what's the actual scientific challenge there, so that we can attract more interest, more people working on those.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you. Just some very brief questions. Mr. Harrison, we've discussed briefly cross-domain solutions, but can you speak specifically to how they would improve the cyber security and resilience of critical national infrastructure?
So, I'll divide my answer into two parts. Firstly, the UK as a country has a great deal of intelligence about what works and what doesn't work in the context of cybersecurity. And we know that both because of our agency's intelligence gathering, but also because we as a country, as all other countries do, are also engaged in the business of trying to break into other people's systems as well. Obviously, that's not something we can talk about, and indeed, or that I'm indeed authorised or qualified to talk about. But clearly, the UK, through its appropriate authorities, is very well informed about what works and what doesn't work, and has chosen a methodology for protecting secret and above secret information, presumably on the basis they believe that that's what's most effective. And if that's what's most effective there, it seems likely that that is equally to be the case, that that would be most effective in the area of protecting critical infrastructure. Whether we wish to be that effective in protecting our critical infrastructure is a decision that I can't opine on, because that's a risk decision that we need to make. There are costs to be incurred, and so on. But nonetheless, it seems to me that it is a logical inevitability that if that is the best way of protecting one set of things, it in a large way will be the best at protecting another. I think if you look at the regulatory framework in the UK, obviously the sector which is being the kind of bellwether for UK cybersecurity regulation is the telecommunications industry, and the Telecommunications Security Act and the Code of Practice that have been published for telecommunications. And if you read the Code of Practice carefully, you will see that it does indeed specifically refer to cross-domain ways of working, I think, are the phrase that's used, and several patterns that do come directly from the principles about cross-domain. I think, however, that there is still amongst those who are working with and interpreting the Code of Practice from a player and a regulatory perspective, still a general lack of understanding of the role that cross-domain solutions and cross-domain ways of working plays within that classified space, because, of course, historically, the people who have known that have been those who have been active in that area rather than in the telecommunications industry. But nonetheless, I think it signposts a direction of travel which is very encouraging.
Dr. Mavroudis, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
Not on this one.
My next question kind of follows on from your response, Mr. Harrison. It's how do you think the government could improve the uptake and visibility of cross-domain solutions across critical national infrastructure?
So I have said before that the cybersecurity industry is very, very noisy, and it spends a lot of money on marketing. The net result of that, of course, is as a result that cybersecurity vendors are not terribly well trusted, because all cybersecurity vendors will stand up and say, we've got the best thing since sliced bread. This is absolutely the thing you need to protect yourself. There is therefore, I think, a critical role for government in promoting what it believes to be the most effective methods of protecting itself, and I think NCSC has done a good job of assembling some of those materials. But I think we have to be conscious that NCSC is not a marketing agency. It is not set up to be a marketing agency. But that if you are going to try and cut through the noise that is generated by the billions of dollars that are spent on marketing by predominantly US and Israeli cybersecurity companies, that there is a role for marketing-like visibility within the UK. What I don't know, because it's not my area of specialty, is how UK government would best organise itself to do that kind of communication But it seems to me that a good starting point, for example, would be within the next iteration, or maybe not a starting point, something we should do is within the next iteration of the national cybersecurity strategy, there should be a reference, for example, to cross-domain solutions. In the United States, there has been a public statement by the White House of the importance of cross-domain solutions in something called National Security Memorandum 8 that was published in January 2022 that called out the particular importance of cross-domain solutions as a defensive technique within the US national security sector. Because we're different, we haven't had to do a similar thing in the UK, but it means that there is something of a void at the top in terms of expressing the importance of this sector from a security perspective.
Thank you. Do you want to add anything, Dr. Mavroudis? Thank you.
Graham, did you want to come in?
Just very briefly, a sort of generalised question. I'm sort of bowled over really by the expertise of the people we've seen this morning. It's just a very general question about many parts of science and technology are bedevilled by specialisms that can't talk to each other. And I don't know enough about your world, possibly to ask sensible questions even, but you all appear to know everything about everything. I'm sure that's not true. So is there a problem in specialisation and when things go wrong of finding the right people who really do understand the nuts and bolts? It's like I could tell you how an internal combustion engine works, but could I repair one now? No. I wouldn't have the faintest idea.
I would hate to give the impression that I know everything about everything, because really I don't. And one thing, for example, right immediately next to me is something I know very little about, which is the sort of artificial intelligence and machine learning work that Dr. Mavroudis works on. I also know very little really about what works in cybersecurity, because in order to know what works, you need to have access to the intelligence about what has been successful, what has not been successful, both when you're trying to do it and when your adversaries are trying to do it. So I think you're absolutely right that people don't know this, and the real challenge is really to get that those authoritative voices heard about what does and what doesn't work in cybersecurity, because they're few and far between.
So how do you deal with that compartmentalisation, specialisation problem?
Well, I deal with it in a very specific way, which is not generalisable to other people. The way I deal with it is that I have a particular set of customers in the UK and its allies who I believe are probably better qualified than anybody else, at least outside of Russia and China, to opine on what does and what doesn't work. And broadly speaking, if they tell me what I'm doing works, then I'm going to trust them. So that's my approach, but it doesn't really scale very effectively to anybody else in the industry.
I agree. Working interdisciplinary is a problem, but also a necessity. I mentioned earlier I totally agree with Mr. Harrison. I know things in a very narrow spectrum. That's what I'm talking about today. But I gave earlier the example of the nuclear fusion reactor startups. And as part of our research, we realized that some of those startups were using machine learning models to control the plasma in the reactor. And indeed, this delivered much better results than the manual way human operators they used previously. I wanted to investigate if this could lead to problems with embedded hidden functionality that doesn't do exactly what you expect it to do at certain times. But I didn't have the expertise to investigate that. So the way we tackle this in the Institute is we have a very wide network. So I was able through that to reach out to nuclear experts in universities. And I agree, it took a little bit of effort. We don't speak the same language. But after a few interactions and meetings, we got to a really good point.
Thank you very much. Dawn wanted to come in.
Thank you. Just very quickly, I just wondered, Dr. Mavroudis, what excites you about AI and what scares you about AI?
A difficult question. AI right now is the way I see it, is a hammer, and we're looking for nails. it can do everything and not that much. The examples we see on the news are primarily around chatbots. I think that's the tip of the iceberg. And overall, in the community, there is a sense that we can do so much more with it. We just need to find the use cases that we can solve right now with the tools we have. The problem we're facing perhaps for the first time from a cybersecurity perspective with machine learning is that we have a truly a black box component that is very hard to analyze and study from first principles in using analytical techniques we've developed in the past decades. They don't necessarily apply to machine learning models. We can compartmentalize it, which in some cases is sufficient, but what I find scary is that we might be pressured to deploy machine learning systems or AI that we don't fully understand, and I think it is important to keep this in mind and follow standard and basic cybersecurity practices will dictate that having such a system as part of a more complicated machinery is not always a good option.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your evidence on cybersecurity and your reflections on some broader questions this morning. So, Mr. Harrison, Dr. Mavroudis, thank you for your evidence, and that concludes this meeting of the committee. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.